Hi, this is Lane, and today in our Current Issues in EdTech podcast series, we'll be exploring the topic of accessibility. Have you ever been frustrated from visiting a web page that was poorly designed, so you couldn't easily find the information you needed? What about the website not loading properly on your device? I know I have. Now, imagine trying to do the same if you're one of the millions of people with a disability. What if you lack certain motor skills in your arm and you couldn't hold the mouse? Or what if you could only hear the text from the web page being read aloud by a screen reader because you are blind? While there are assistive technologies that help people with impairments, the design of certain web pages and online courses sometimes make it difficult for people with disabilities to use these aids. Also, the design of a web page or online course can also affect the millions of people and learners with disabilities who don't use assistive technologies. For us aspiring educational technologists, it's imperative that we create accessibility and instructional design. We'll start today with a definition, then we'll explore some laws regarding it, and finally we'll see how this affects our work. Accessibility is defined by the Office for Civil Rights as when a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective manner with substantially equal ease of use. In other words, people with disabilities should be able to access information and public services with reasonable accommodations which do not limit them in any way to engage with the content in any less meaningful of a way. As educational technologists, it's our ethical duty to consider the diverse needs of all of our learners, those with and without disabilities, in designing instruction. Not only does accessibility help learners with disabilities, but it's also the law. So let's begin with a brief legal background. In 1990, in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act prevented discrimination based on disability by any program or activity that receives federal funding. This would include schools, obviously. The 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, made it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities in sectors of public life. This would include education. Since the internet was in its infancy in 1990, in 1996, the Department of Justice issued an advisory letter suggesting that the ADA cover entities on the internet whose services are deemed to be public accommodations. The 1998 Workforce Investment Act reinforced the law concerning accessibility for federal employees with disabilities and members of the public with disabilities trying to access federal information. So, has the ADA been effective? While originally thought to help close the gap in areas where access had previously been denied by those with disabilities, the internet created other difficulties. By 2002, over 10 years after the passage of ADA, more people than ever with disabilities were unemployed. And while many were enrolling in universities at higher rates than ever before, many of them were not graduating. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, among people aged 25 and older in 2014, the graduation rate for students with disabilities was 80% compared to 90% for their non-disabled peers. In higher education, the gap increases. 16% of people with a disability had completed at least a bachelor's degree. By comparison, 35% of people with no disability had completed at least a bachelor's degree or higher. However, since then, with a greater emphasis on accessibility online and in online education, the learning experience is improving, not just for learners with disabilities, but all learners. Accessible design is a similar school of thought to universal design. Universal design is designing something so that it may be used or understood by the greatest number of people possible. Think of a sloped entrance to a building. It can be used by anyone, even someone with a wheelchair. Accessible design, on the other hand, specifically considers people with disabilities, like building a web page and ensuring it is fully functional with just a keyboard and ensuring that the most frequently clicked links are the easiest to get to. Now, let's look at the four main impairment categories and how they affect the learner. Visual impairments may range from complete blindness to only being able to read large text to color blindness. Those with auditory impairments may have trouble, may be completely deaf, or just simply have trouble hearing over background noises. Those with mobility impairments may have difficulty using the keyboard, mouse, or both. Those with cognitive impairments um, may have difficulty in processing and understanding information. Assistive technologies such as screen readers and closed captioning, excuse me, can provide access to those with impairments, but the content must be designed and tested in a way that allows those aids to work. The most widely accepted standards for providing guidelines on accessibility are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, published by an international standardization organization. They can be found at w3.org. Each of the 14 guidelines describes a principle of accessible design. Some examples include providing text alternatives for non-text content, making everything on the page functional with only a keyboard, and making web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. There are numerous validation tools available online, such as aPrompt, CC Verify, and the W3C HTML validation tool. Some of the most common things that we as educational technologists should consider are visual clarity and size, contrast, and spacing of text, consistent use of color and font, use of color as a means of enhancing meaning, structured organization, saving documents in multiple formats such as PDF or Word, not using blinking or fast animations, text descriptions for images and sounds, and transcripts and closed captioning. So as you can see, not only are we legally required to provide and promote accessibility, it's our ethical responsibility. As noted in multiple publications and studies on the subject, not only does increasing accessibility benefit our students with disabilities, but it benefits all of our students. This is something you'll want to learn more about as you continue the program and design instruction. Just like how online learning isn't going away, neither is the need for accessibility. Not only that, as our society becomes increasingly cognizant of social justice, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that accessibility is not just a conversation concerning students with physical and mental disabilities. Accessibility is often included in the larger conversation on equity and inclusion in learning. Access can take the form of overcoming socioeconomic barriers or feelings of human connection in online learning. In one study published in 2019 by the International Review of Research in Open Distance Learning, Fermín González analyzed a decade of literature on accessibility as it relates to inclusion and equity in online learning. She found that while 57% of the literature focused on disabilities discussed in this podcast, 43% focused on barriers described as other human differences that hinder accessibility. Some of these may include differences attributed to age, gender, state of health, cultural or racial differences, social class, and simply personality. I can only see the issue of accessibility, inclusion, and equity in online learning continue to gain traction as it reflects our current socio-political climate. A good place to begin exploring accessibility is Burt Clapper and McRae's article, Accessible Online Instruction for Students with Disabilities. Two books worth looking into on the topic are Creating Accessible Online Instruction Using Universal Design Principles by Brady Lund and Advancing Online Teaching, Creating Equity-Based Digital Learning Environments by Kelly and Zacharajczyk. You may want to also familiarize yourself with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 that I mentioned earlier, which can be found once again at w3.org. Thanks. Thanks for listening.